Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome back to episode 16 of The Stolen Land, Nettle's Crossing. The next day was another rainy day. It was just getting to that time of year where the rains came back and started turning everything into mud before winter set in and froze everything solid. The expedition was happy to stop by the Sootscale caves for some warmth and a hot meal and time to dry off. Cheif Sootscale was clearly keeping up on his end of their deal as he happily showed the expedition around the caves. Everything was cleaner than the last time they had been there, and holes had been expertly dug into the roofs of the cave system, allowing a large amount of smoke to exhaust and not fill up the caves, while still keeping them relatively dry. He even showed them where his kobolds were beginning to dig up silver again, and where he was storing it until the area was claimed by someone who would deal fairly with the Sootscales and agree to uphold the alliance that he had with the expedition. For his part, Lucian promised that if he was the person who was next able to claim the green... For his part, Lucian promised that if he was the person who was next able to claim the green belt, he would find a dwarven smith to send to the Sootscales to teach them what to do with all their silver they were mining. This would empower them even more, allowing them to become a power strong enough to need to be taken seriously, in case whoever ended up with the green belt later would have to deal with the Sootscales as a legitimate power in the area, rather than the nuisance that most people wrote kobolds off as. At this time, Cheif Sootscale informed Lucian that he was dimly aware of other hostile kobolds who were from different tribes. He was not aware of any other warrens, but there were at least some migrating kobolds around. The expedition thanked the chief for everything before they were leaving to finish mapping the area. That night they slept in the security of the Kobold Warren and had the best night's sleep they had had outside of Oleg's in the better part of a year. The next day was focused around the area around the old sycamore, stopping by it to make sure the Mite Cave was still unattended. The cave ended up being just as abandoned as when they had left it, and Tiber and Umbria even stayed behind for a while to collapse the entrance in on itself, just to make sure it stayed that way for as long as possible. The best part of the day was that it was not raining, but it was most certainly overcast and not that pleasant of a day, but it was uneventful as they mapped out another few square miles of hills. That night they sat at the fire, talking, as they did most nights, and most of the group looked a little dejected. Figuring he knew what was happening, Lucian looked at all of them before focusing on Tiber. Tiber, how many square miles have we mapped? Tiber looked up in a bit of confusion for a few moments. He had not been expecting the question, although it was in a similar vein to what he had been thinking of. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out his notes before finally looking back up at Lucian a few minutes later. 336 or thereabout. Lucian nodded. Now, I know you're all getting tired of this incessant mapping that we've been doing for quite a while, and the 1,056 square miles of the green belt as defined in our charter seems unreachable. But the other way to look at it is, tomorrow we will hit 1/3 of the way through the entire project. I'm sure there are plenty of interesting things ahead to find, and beyond that, I'm sure we'll face the Stag Lord before we finish. I would be surprised if we got much more than halfway through mapping before we found his fort and had our confrontation with him. Whatever he has as a base camp, I'm sure it's probably on the shores of the Tuskwater Lake, which will be reaching in 1 or maybe 2 more excursions from Oleg's. Each of the 3 others of the group thought about Lucian's words for a minute, taking them in and chewing them over. Petra was the first among them to talk. Then why don't we go there sooner? If you're so sure that he's on the Tuskwater Lake, why don't we go check it out and see? Because I want to be in a better position before we do so. After 2 more days of mapping, we'll finish this trip and go back to Oleg's. It's not a great idea for us to cut this excursion short, as I'm sure you can see. Now, we could go there straight next excursion. He paused there and let at least Petra and Umbria thought that this was a good idea. Tiber, on the other hand, seemed to be waiting for the but, which quickly came. But I don't think that's wise. When we end this excursion, we will have a solid grasp on the lands east of the Strike River and the Thorn Rivers, as well as the bit north of the eastern spit of the Gnarl Marches. If we push that to everything east of the Skunk River and north of the Shrike River, then I think we will have a solid enough grasp on what most of the Greenbelt looks like to have the best plan when we go up against the Staglord. Umbria looked thoughtful as she quickly did some math in her head. Not to mention that by that point we'll have mapped just under half of the Greenbelt. We'll have the only map that is good enough to rule any part of the Greenbelt from, as well as having killed the Staglord. We would, without a doubt, have the strongest claim to rule the Greenbelt. Lucian smiled and pointed at Umbria. That is exactly it. When the Staglord is killed, the Sword Lords will most likely make their decision on what happens next in the Greenbelt. He's the only person who holds a good claim over the area, outside of the growing influence of Oleg that we're helping grow. Without the Staglord, the Greenbelt is leaderless, and a claim can be pushed. I want to make sure that our claim is as strong as it possibly can be when the time comes. Right now, the Sword Lords have all the say, but it'd be easiest if they picked someone with a strong claim, and the strongest 2 claims are us and Oleg. And I'm sure Oleg would back us rather than become a king in his own right. If we can finish our map to at least the Skunk River, we can prove that we can start ruling the belt on day 1, and I think that guarantees our claim. And the rest of the party agreed with Lucian on that point, and their conversation moved to other topics before eventually they went to bed, except for Tiber, who had pulled the first watch. The night went by quietly, except for rain starting early in the next morning. The next day went without much of note as they continued to map along the Strike River. It was just a normal day of rain and mapping and trying hard to keep the pages dry. Until near the end of their day, when they came across an old, destroyed bridge. The sun was starting to get low in the sky when the expedition, who had been walking along the shore of the Shrike River, came across what had clearly been a rope bridge going across the river. Only one thick, sagging rope remained of the bridge. It looked like it had been one of the handholds. A few of the supporting ropes that had all snapped still hung from it. Nearby, the small anchors that held the handhold ropes to either side of the river. There was a sign that said Nettle's Crossing, 5 coppers, ring bell for service. And a rusty bell hung next to the sign. Petra was the first to notice and point out the building that was on the other side. "Look," she said, pointing. "It looks like it was a building of some kind before it probably burned down." Each of the other members noticed soon after the burned husk that sat there slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching vegetation. Tiber took this moment to say a prayer to Saren Ray before the party had meant to turn around and finish mapping for the day. This planned leaving was stopped, however, as a clearly rotting body pulled itself out of the water and started walking toward the party on top of the water, holding a Renseur in one hand. The flesh of this body was putrescent, with an almost completely rotted pair of pants on the corpse. The party prepared to fight the creature, but before Lucian gave the order, the creature began to speak. It called out in an eerie, soggy voice, "You are not my tormentors. Throw the Staglord's body into the river, that I may look upon his death." or join me instead. When the party did not immediately attack, at that point the undead thing sank back into the water and disappeared. Lucian took that moment to push the party away, rather than try and stop and talk about what had happened at that point. Whenever anyone would look at him to try and talk about what had happened, he shook his head and said, "When we were camped for the night." And that lasted through the last little bit of mapping that they had wanted to do that day, and through the setting up of the camp for the evening. Once they sat down for the night, it was very clear that the party was not going to continue to being okay with Lucian putting off Once they sat down for the night, it was very clear that the party was not going to continue being okay with Lucian putting off talking about what had happened at Nettle's Crossing. So, he finally began to speak about it. That was quite the experience we had today, he began. "I'd say," Tiber snapped back, making it clear he was not happy about the understatement. Choosing to ignore Tiber's remark, Lucian continued. "Well, that was clearly a frightening sight. I'm very happy that no one reacted rashly. There's no telling what would have happened if we had attacked that creature. I am of the opinion that we do as it asks. All it wants us to do is kill someone we were already going to kill, and then push their body in the water." He looked to Tiber, the resident cleric. "What do you think would happen if we do that?" Tiber thought about it for a few seconds, and then shrugged. "It really depends on exactly what that undead thing is. It appears to be on some sort of vengeance quest, so giving it what it wants should either dispel it, putting its body to rest, or..." He paused uncomfortably at this before rushing forward with his words. "It'll become much stronger and we'll have to deal with it again later. So, either the creature finds rest, and that is the end of things, or it becomes more powerful and leaves us with a bigger mess to deal with. Does that about sum it up?" Lucian asked with a wry smile. Tiber nodded. "Yeah, that about sums it up." Umbria butted in at this time. "That is all well and good, but what if we have to prove we killed the Stag Lord? I mean, we were hired to kill him, and generally such things require proof, don't they?" Petra nodded her agreement with Umbria. "In my experience, that is true. Generally, to collect a reward on a job that involves killing, you have to come back with some proof that you indeed killed the person you were hired to kill." Lucian cut in at this point. "Technically, no. We've not actually been hired to kill the Stag Lord. We've been hired to map out the Green Belt. At this point, killing the Stag Lord just seems to be something that will naturally work itself out. Although, the interesting thing about what this creature said is that it heavily implies what we were talking about last night. The Stag Lord's fort must be near the headwater of the Shrike River." Tiber agreed with this last sentence. "I would bet far too much on that point. Not only does that make sense given what we know about the geography of this area, but I doubt that this creature is aware of anything outside of its river or the close environs. Either way, a confrontation with the Stag Lord seems inevitable at this point. Rostov needs a stable set of nations it can ally with to the south. Each of the 4 sections of the Stolen Land are very important to Rostov in their own ways." Petra rolled her eyes a bit at this everything is important spiel from Lucian. "And how is the Greenbelt important? I can see the Tors of Levenis, as they are the closest part to Rostov, and the Huktong Slough stands between the Rostov Plains and Pitax, the only one of the river kingdoms likely to intervene on Isia's side. I don't see how the Greenbelt is that important outside of just the headache that the Stag Lord or similar could provoke in times of war." Umbria was the first to answer Petra. "Simple. The Greenbelt is what stands between Rostland and Maivan. She caught the look on Petra and Tiber's face before she hastily continued. When Chorl the Conqueror came to take over Issia and Rustland, Issia laid down arms and quickly joined his force without resisting. Rustland and the Eldori Sword Lords fought back. They lost, and most of the Rustlanders and many Sword Lords ended up bending the knee. There was a faction of the Sword Lords who saw the writing on the wall before the fighting began, and they fled south to Maivon. To this day, the Maivani Eldori, as they are now known, worry about the cowardice of their ancestors. A civil war between Rustland and Issia in Brevoy could be the opportunity for at least some of them to start redeeming their ancestors. The best way for them to join such a war would be for them to travel up the Little Salin River into Candlemere and then Tuskwater. Once there, they would take the Shrike River all the way to Rostov. If the Stag Lord's Fort is where we think it is, he would be in the perfect place to prevent them from taking the Shrike River to where they need to go, or at least to delay them and sap at least some of their strength. Lucian simply held out his hand, pointing toward Umbria. What she said. I couldn't have put that better. If this war happens sooner rather than later, the importance of the Green Belt will be mainly for Maivon to be able to easily enter the war, and to prevent bandits from being something the Sword Lords have to deal with. If the war happens later, both of those short-term strategic goals will still be in effect, as well as this land will be great for settling and will be able to stand on its own as a prosperous nation to help their northern neighbors. The Sword Lords want this to be a successful, so they're going to give as much support as they think they can get away with, but they're also going to be doing that to make sure when the war does almost inevitably come, whoever is the leader of the Greenbelt feels indebted to them and therefore will feel obligated to come to their aid. Petra took in all of that information and processed it by looking deep into the fire before finally replying. Okay. I will grant all of that may be true. However, if the Greenbelt is so important, why send us? She held up a hand to indicate that she was not done, and no one should answer that question yet. I mean, you, Lucian, our fearless leader, to be brutally blunt, are just the guy who wants to join the Sword Lords. She then turned to Tiber. You are the bastard to some noble house from Brevoy. Umbria, you're just a wizard from Issia. And I'm a brigand who saw this expedition as a great opportunity to lay low off the edge of the map, as it were, while the heat around my head cools. I don't mean to offend, but we're the very definition of ragtag. The three other areas of the Stolen Land where they're trying to set up other nations. To the Glenborn uplands, they sent the Iron Wraiths. Maybe once they were just as ragtag as us, but they've established themselves as fairly experienced adventurers. The Noman Heights got an entire mercenary company led by a sword lord. Granted, a relatively low-ranking one, but still a sword lord. And to the Hooktongue Slough, a small army of diplomats and high-ranking soldiers were sent. In every case, we have large groups of experienced and trustworthy people who were sent out. And then there's us, and the Greenbelt. We're four people who make up a very ragtag group. I mean, I know we've been calling ourselves the Voso Expedition, but that's a little bit grand for what we are. She then looked to Umbria. Now, you say it is vital for cowards from Maivon to try and redeem their honor or some such. Then she pivoted to Lucian. And you say the Stag Lord is a real concern. In spite of those being true, they sent us just to map out the area. I see quite the imbalance there. You have good points there, Petra. I will grant you that. I can't help but feel we might just be the first group sent in to provide maps for a second group that fits the mold of the other 3 expeditions. That is why I made sure that Tiber is not the most direct in making his maps. I want to be sure that when it comes time to start, to set up a leader, we will be the best choice. Everyone was silent, lost in their own thoughts after that for quite a while. Eventually, conversation picked up again, but it was on to other topics similar to what they had spent most of their evenings talking about. But at this point, each member of the small expedition knew each other very well. When it was time, everyone went for bed, except for Lucian, who had first watched that night. The night passed slowly and coldly, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. The next day was cold and rainy as they moved in to fill in the last bit of the map for that section of the Greenbelt. Partway through the day, they ran into one of the many hunters that Oleg talked about traveling in the Greenbelt. Apparently, she had just stopped by Oleg's for her once-a-season stop, and had word that there were people at Oleg's who were waiting for the party. The party thanked her and went on their way. A bit later in the day, they found a small treasure buried at the foot of a dead tree. They found an area that clearly something had been buried there at some point, and after a few minutes of digging, they found a leather cloak that was covering a masterfully done dagger, a wand of some kind, a silver ring, and a mostly destroyed spellbook. That night, they camped, knowing that they would reach Oleg's tomorrow and end the 4th excursion. Partway through the night, Umbria looked up from examining the spellbook. It looks like there are 5 spells that are still readable from this book. Well, I already know 2 of them. I don't know the other 3. If we can make sure our stop at Oleg's is at least a day or 2 longer than it normally would be, before we set out again, I can fully copy these spells into my spellbook. They may be useful in the future. The next morning was cold, but bright. The rain clouds a distant memory. Or rather, it would have been a distant memory if the ground wasn't turning to mud. Either way, the Voso expedition made it back to Oleg's in the early afternoon, and as they approached, the gates swung open and Keston Garrus ran out. "Oh, thank the gods that you are back. Come, hurry, there's much to talk about. Everything has changed since you left." Thank you so much for listening to episode 16 of The Stolen Land. Tune in next week for episode 17, The Beginning of the End.